Hello and welcome to the RPG Blender, where we give lesser played games and forgotten settings the roll the dice they deserve. I am your host, Game Master George, and today we're talking Castlevania. If you watched my video on Zelda ripoffs, then you probably already know that I am a big Castlevania fan. While I can't claim to have played every Castlevania game to completion, I have played the vast majority of them. Starting from the tender young years firing up Castlevania 3 on my NES, I spent hours as a child trying desperately to make it up that stupid clock tower. Trauma aside, Castlevania was cemented by that as one of the franchises that I would follow forever. Heck, I even played Lord of Shadows, and didn't hate it, but the real bread and butter for me were the Game Boy Advance games. See, I didn't have a PlayStation, so those Game Boy Advance games were my first exposure to the Metroid style of Castlevania game, and it blew my childhood mind. They were easily some of my most played games throughout my teenage years. So a few years back, when Netflix announced the Castlevania animated series, I was thrilled. As soon as that launched, I binged the entire first series and then promptly forgot about it for years until the full series had already released, and then I binged them all a couple years back when my son was born. Nothing like a little graphically violent animated vampire story while you're sitting up with your newborn child. And I started to wonder, are there any tabletop games that accurately present the style of gameplay you find in a good Castlevania game? I thought at first, I'll make a little listicle about it, 5 games, just like I did for the Zelda series. But, well, there's one that is pretty much just a blatant copy. That being Rhapsody of Blood. So today we're going to be taking a look at Rhapsody of Blood, seeing what I think of this game, giving it my scores, and telling you whether I think that it's worth playing, and if it accurately represents what I feel Castlevania gameplay is all about. Rhapsody of Blood is a part of the Worlds of Legacy tabletop games. They are based around generational gameplay, where you'll be creating a bloodline of characters, and through each iteration of whatever the theme is, you'll be creating a new specific character from that bloodline. These are powered by the Apocalypse games, which we'll be talking about more a little bit later. But this common through line keeps them easily accessible. Once you've learned one, it's easy to translate to another. The one that we're talking about here is, of course, Rhapsody of Blood, their Castlevania-inspired dungeon exploration game. You play as heroes of a cursed or sainted or heroic bloodline, fated to conflict with the Dark Castle. Through the generations, your bloodline will send champion after champion to oppose the regent, striking down their acolytes and making their way through the castle to eventually confront the regent and prevent a horrid curse from falling upon the land. What can I say? This is pretty perfect. The setting is exactly what you would want in a Castlevania game. The entirety of the game focuses around dungeon exploration. The castle, which is exactly the gameplay that you would expect. Now, obviously, it is hard to replicate things like platforming challenges, so what they focus primarily on are traps and enemies. But for the setting, I obviously give this one a 5. It perfectly encapsulates the feeling of being in a Castlevania game. Alright, next up, let's talk mechanics. I have already stated that this is a Powered by the Apocalypse game. If you're not familiar with Powered by the Apocalypse, these are narrative-first games. You describe the action that you're going to take, and your description points toward a specific move within the game. That move then tells you what stat you are going to be adding to your 2d6 roll, and tells you the results when you get a hit. You get a hit on a 7 or higher. A 7 to 9 is typically a weaker hit. You'll either get a reduced benefit or some kind of consequence. If you are then to roll a 10 or higher, you're getting the strong hit. These typically come with an unqualified success, no downside, or an extra benefit. Each Powered by the Apocalypse game creates its own moves, these moves being tied to the themes of the game. So in this, we'll find moves like Travel the Labyrinth. Within this system, however, there are different types of moves. We have our exploration moves. This is for when you are going through the castle. You also have confrontation moves. These are specifically used when you are fighting the bosses of the game. And then we have actually a third subset of moves, your bloodline moves. Bloodline moves can typically only be used at one of your base camps. What you'll notice here is that there is very little in the way of social mechanics. You have covenants that you form with your fellow PCs, but there are basically no mechanics about dealing with NPCs peaceably. Keeping with the genre, that is not necessarily an incorrect thing. When you look at most Castlevania games, you spend 99% of it walking through a castle and fighting monsters. You might occasionally talk to a random NPC, but it is just a scripted back and forth. There's no meaningful choices or interactions to be had. While that works very well for a Castlevania game, when you're playing a tabletop role-playing game, you usually expect some role-playing. But in all honesty, if you're looking at this game for its main focus, which is explore the castle, fight stuff, and defeat the regent, the mechanics are all perfectly catered around that. The problem here comes with some of the limitations of your moves. Now, this is a problem with all Powered by the Apocalypse games, in my opinion. Because you are focusing your actions into moves, in practice, you are very limited in how you can approach situations. You can narrate yourself taking on a horde however you want, but in the end, you will always be rolling with iron, because that's what the Face the Horde move says to do. If you're attempting to use your strength to climb up a wall out of danger, or to swing on a rope, you will always be rolling with mercury, not iron, because that's what the Flow Like Water move tells you to do. When running the actual play that's going to be coming up very, very soon, make sure you're subscribed so you can see that when it happens, one of my players actually talked to me about how they were feeling limited by the way these moves are structured. And I couldn't disagree. These limitations are present in all Powered by the Apocalypse games, and as you run more of them, you will probably find yourself doing what I did, substituting stats based on description. And that's why I give it a 3. The mechanics are very easy to approach, and the limited scope very much fits with the setting theme. But the game is hurt by its refusal to even take the smallest step outside of those limitations. The mechanics are good, there's no denying it, but it hasn't managed to raise itself above. Alright, next up, let's talk about running the game. If you've never run a Powered by the Apocalypse game, you are in for a shock. You as the game master don't do anything. That is a gross oversimplification. That's definitely not true. But it can feel like you don't do anything. That all you're doing is adjudicating things that your players do. And that comes down to your mechanics of reactions. When you are doing something, one of your monsters, your regent, your acolyte is doing something, it is a reaction to something that the players are doing. Most often, this is because they failed a roll. But I'll tell you, that doesn't happen as often as you'd like. With every roll having a static 7 target, it can feel like your players are always succeeding. After all, on 2d6, the average roll is going to be 7. And then adding into that bonuses they have from their stats, you'll find your players are focusing in the areas that they're good at and succeeding most of the time. For your players, that probably feels really awesome, but for the game master, it can feel like you're then doing nothing. But the key is that reactions are not only limited to when players fail. And this is something that I struggled with at first when I started running this game. These reaction moves that you take will primarily be taken when failures happen, but they will also happen when your players specifically fall into your traps. As such, building an encounter in this system is much more akin to building a puzzle room than it is to a combat encounter. You give your enemies defensive traits. Perhaps they're able to resist certain types of damages, or maybe they counter magical spells. Maybe they have an aura that affects creatures that come in close. And then when your players take an action which falls into one of those traps, that's your trigger to use the reaction. I apologize if this sounds reductive or obvious, but it really isn't at first. When you're running most games, you're used to your enemies getting their own action, their own time to choose and do something. But here, that opportunity is limited. Unless your players are falling into your traps, or if your players are taking way too long to decide on their actions and it's time to move the gameplay along, you're gonna find that most of what you're doing is just reacting to players' rolls. Now, I mentioned that there is a static difficulty. They are more likely to succeed at a given roll than they are to fail. That can seem like a problem, A Castlevania-inspired game should be dangerous. It should be deadly. Your players should be fearing for their lives as they go up against these hordes. But how does that work if your players are succeeding on everything? Well, the truth is, the main threat to your players is not failure, is not enemy actions. It is attrition. This game is all about slowly whittling down the resources that your players have. See, most of the moves here, even on a hit, will carry a negative consequence. Take, for example, Face the Horde. Your players are rolling with iron, so when your martial melee character that has +2 iron goes in, they only need to roll a 5 on their 2d6 to get a hit. And on a hit, they cut through the minions. But they will be choosing consequences for their roll. They might be taking harm. They might be taking contamination. They might end up in a risky position. Or there might be more of them coming. On a roll of 7 to 9, you're choosing 2 of those consequences to have happen each time you have to face a horde of minions. On a 10+, you still have to choose 1. As you can see, even on a success, you're still whittling down resources. And that's how you need to approach this game. Each individual combat is not meant to be a deadly experience. Instead, they're meant to chip away at your players. The mini-monsters weakening them until they come up against a larger threat that can actually dish out some serious harm. So what this is to say is that once I shifted my mentality from making every combat feel like a life or death situation to making it more about them carefully choosing which of the consequences they could afford to take in the moment, things became much more intense. But now I mentioned something a little bit earlier, which is the Travel the Labyrinth roll. It's your job to pre-create minions, traps, and the acolytes and regions that you're going to find along the way. Your players then roll, and depending on their roll, they might come into a room full of minions, or a trapped room. As they go, they'll build up their hold until they can eventually spend it to reach the acolyte's room. This dramatically cuts out the amount of prep work that you need to do as a game master. All you need to do is create the number of wards that you want to use, give your minions, acolytes, and regent their abilities, and you're basically good to go. From there, it's up to the roll of the dice to see just what predicaments the players end up in. This is a surprisingly tight system, with different interconnected systems working together to support this randomized generation. But I have to say, I like making maps. So I was very happy to see that in one of their supplements, they have rules for instead pre-generating a map. I found that building out the castle was more fun for me, but there are problems with it. As they have expanded the line to other books, they've lost a little bit of the thread. For example, looking at the variant that I was using, you replace the Travel the Labyrinth action with one that allows them to commune with the labyrinth and be given a map of the surrounding area. The problem with that, certain mechanics are tied to hold, which is only generated through the Travel the Labyrinth rolls. If, for instance, you're playing a Reckoner, you have moves where you can spend the hold from that to accomplish different tasks. But if you're using this variant, there is no way for you to gain hold. As another example, in one of the expansion classes, we have the Captain. The Captain has one major ability which allows you to use the Stand With Me roll outside of confrontations. What does the Stand With Me roll do? Well, it's a heal, and normally that healing is balanced by the fact that you can only take it when you are locked in mortal struggle with an enemy that has real potential to kill you. But if you can then take that move during the exploration phase, your players are free to heal up to max at any time, taking away the threat of attrition that we were just talking about. This all sums up to say that this is not a perfect game when you're trying to run it. It is hard to digest, and for me, someone who has played a fairly large number of games as the DM, it took me a couple sessions before I felt comfortable in what I was doing. But if you are somebody who has run Powered by the Apocalypse games, you'll probably find the transition easier. I score this a 4 for running. As I said, it takes a while to build the muscle memory for this gameplay, but once it works, the puzzle-based combat, it clicked deliciously for me. And I would 100% be using that in other games moving forward. Plus, I don't have to roll dice in this game, so my horrendous luck doesn't make things too easy for the players. Alright, now the last area to talk about with this game is the characters. Powered by the Apocalypse games, in my opinion and my experience, tend to suffer in this regard. Playbooks for this game system tend to be very restrictive. You make very few choices as you're building your character. You get very few moves with few potentials to grow throughout. However, this is the first Powered by the Apocalypse game that I feel has solved this problem decently well. They do this through the generational system. You're not just choosing one playbook, you're choosing two. One for your bloodline and one for yourself. And that playbook for yourself is only for your current iteration of the character. Because you see, each time that you're building a new character, you are choosing a new playbook. This dual playbook system solves my largest issue with these games. That is, not to say that it's perfect, of course. Each individual playbook is still limited in its choices, but when you're getting to swap out your character every few sessions, you don't feel it quite as much as you would in a longer game. Now, while we're on the topic, let's talk about advancement. Advancement in this system, oh, delicious. You advance by gaining contamination. Contamination is the essence of the Dark Castle, sinking into your characters, corrupting them, but giving them greater powers in the process. Every time you gain 3 contamination, you raise your blood by 1. When you raise your blood, you gain a blood gift. This could be a powerful blood move, or it could raise one of your stats. This can happen a total of 4 times for your character. Twice to raise your stats, and twice to get a blood gift. If your blood then increases again, your character is fully corrupted and claimed by the castle. I don't usually like the forced retirement mechanics of Powered by the Apocalypse games. They feel like they're a way to excuse the lack of growth potential. But in this system, with this setup, it's perfect. It plays into that attrition I was talking about earlier. You see, contamination is not only a consequence of attacks. Whenever your players defeat an acolyte, they can choose to willingly increase their blood. So for your players, this contamination and their blood level becomes another element that they're trying to balance out, making sure that they're gaining enough strength to be able to continue their fight against the stronger and stronger enemies without falling to the darkness. This is one of the few times that I find a character retirement mechanic fits thematically. Your blood then at the end determines who gets the potential to seize the power of the castle for themselves, being able to harness it into a wish for immortality, undoing one of the curses of the castle, gaining power for their bloodline, or any number of other things, but at the cost of then being claimed by it. Your character then becoming part of the castle, one of the future threats that will be faced on the next generation. Meanwhile, any characters of lower blood, or the highest character if they choose not to claim it, will then gain blood gifts for their bloodline, improving it for the next generation and the ones after that. You have constant iterative growth, which is something that you don't always see in Powered by the Apocalypse games, which tend to build in a power ceiling. And this change, however minor it may appear, greatly expands the potential for long campaign play. I find that this character creation system, because of the generational gameplay, works far better than anything I've seen in a different Powered by the Apocalypse game. As such, I give it a 4. The choice of 2 different playbooks, as well as regularly swapping out one of them, keeps your character feeling fresh, even with a limited pool of moves. Alright, so all of that out of the way, what do I think of this game? What is my final score? My final score is a 4. This is a solid game. This is a game that is better than most. It has taken the Powered by the Apocalypse mechanics, and while it hasn't done anything overly inventive with them, the small changes that they have made greatly help to set themselves apart in terms of both satisfying gameplay and just capturing the theme. I have personally been having a blast running this game, and not just because I'm a Castlevania fanboy. This is a game that I would thoroughly recommend for anyone who enjoys dungeon exploration and likes the more narrative style gameplay of a Powered by the Apocalypse game. If you want a dungeon crawl that isn't about tactical positioning, this is probably one of the best fits you could find. And if you're not certain, well, you could always check out our actual play. We'll be beginning our actual play probably tomorrow if you're watching this live. So make sure you're subscribed and got those notifications turned on to see it when it goes live. And if you agree with me that this seems like a good game, you'll find an affiliate link in the description. You can pick it up for no extra cost to you and get to support the channel at the same time. Especially with TTRPG, all that money basically just goes into me picking up new games to introduce you guys to. Anyway, if you liked the video, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Dislike it if you didn't like it, and shatter my poor weak heart. Anyway, thank you for coming out. I hope you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for much, much more. I'm your host, Game Master George, and remember, there's gaming outside the Forgotten Realms. I'm your host, Game Master George, and remember, there's gaming outside the Forgotten Realms.